In 1976, 4 men returned from the Allagash wilderness claiming that they had been abducted by aliens. Later, one of them began having odd encounters with strangers, and then an unmarked helicopter flew over his house. Well, at some point, he began acting very differently than the others, and in 2016, he completely changed his story, and he said that no, there had not been any abduction, that it had all been just one big lie to make money. What exactly is it that makes a person change his or her story about personal knowledge of an extraordinary experience? And when that happens, are we just supposed to accept that that person's original account was the lie and now he or she is telling the truth? Well, I'm sure you know that accounts like these have been taking place for centuries, and it's never been an easy thing to sort out. Once a person takes back his or her statement about something so extraordinary, just about everyone from that point on says, "See, I knew it was all just one big lie." A good 300 years before this Allagash wilderness experience, a middle-aged man discovered that there was something off with the current view of the universe. We've all heard of Galileo Galilei. He's now well known, and his ideas are universally accepted. But it wasn't always like that. During his time, everyone thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, but he suspected that everyone was wrong. He believed that the sun was the center of the universe. This idea had been pondered before, but unlike others who had their suspicions, Galileo had created a device to test his beliefs. On a clear night in January 1610, he aimed this device, a telescope, at the planet of Jupiter, and for the first time in recorded history, a human saw that Jupiter had moons. And then over the next year, he also discovered that Venus had phases like that of a moon. For Galileo, this was all the proof that one needed. A few years later, in 1632, he published a comprehensive book titled Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. In this book, he argued that objects in the sky were not as everyone had thought that they were. While most people thought that this man was just crazy, some people started to ponder. Well, the powers that be just could not allow that, so they began to harass him. But he just would not shut up. So in April of 1633, he was ordered to turn himself in. At first, he stood his ground, but then, on June 22nd, 1633, he was taken into a room and he was shown all sorts of ingenious, torturous devices. And he was told that they would really rather not have to use these devices, and he could clear all of this silliness up if he would just recant his ideas. So he did what I suppose most people would do in his situation, and he publicly cursed and detested those horrible lies that he had fabricated about the sun being at the center of the universe. He made a statement and he signed some official documents, which were quickly distributed to the public. Then he received a life sentence, and he was of course banned from spreading any more of his lies. His sentence was commuted to house arrest, and he died about 8 years later at the age of 77 as just some crazy old man who had once lied about some crazy ideas of some things that he had claimed that he had seen in the skies. In this video, we're going to explore the possibility that there just might be a little bit more to aliens and alien abductions than what people think. And sometimes some of the more convincing stories are either never told or they're quickly recanted because of pressure that comes from behind the scenes. And to do this, we're going to be highlighting the story of 4 men who went canoeing deep in the Allagash wilderness. One extremely dark night, their canoe was chased by a beam of light, and then they were suddenly sucked up and whisked away to a brightly lighted examination area of sorts. We'll share their experience, and then we'll share how once they returned, one of them began having odd encounters with strangers, and then he saw a black unmarked helicopter fly over his house. Finally, we'll share how many years later this man completely changed his story. He even wrote a book about how they had all lied for money. Then stick with us for our Fact or Fiction segment. There, I'll give you my thoughts on this case. And then Amy is going to come on, and she's going to share some pretty interesting information about the anatomy differences that the men said they noticed in the hands of these aliens. So, this story begins just as a bush plane was getting ready to land on a lake deep in the Allagash wilderness. It was a crisp Monday morning, August 22nd, 1976, as a tiny propeller airplane touched down on the Talos Lake in the state of Maine in the heart of the Allagash wilderness. This area is so remote that the only way in or out is either by helicopter or bush plane. The people on board included the pilot and 2 passengers. The passengers, Jack Weiner and Charlie Foltz, were in their mid to late 20s, and they were full of excitement. They and 2 others had planned a 2-week canoeing trip that would begin here in this remote lake, and the plane that they had chartered was so small that it could only transport 2 at a time. So Jack and Charlie unstrapped the canoe, loaded all of their supplies, got on board, and then paddled toward the shore as the pilot flew back and returned with their 2 companions. Before long, all 4 men, Jim and Jack Weiner, twins, Charlie Foltz, ex-veteran, and another man named Chuck Rak, were all setting up camp on the shore of the lake. The first night was full of excitement. In the morning, they would all be embarking on a once-in-a-lifetime adventure that few people ever get to do. Well, the next morning, all 4 of them cleaned up the campsite, loaded the 2 canoes, and headed out into the water, 2 men in each canoe. They paddled upriver all day long, making it all the way to Chamberlain Lake, and it was just after dusk when they landed on Mud Beach. When they arrived, they found other campers with a campfire already blazing. And while the 4 of them were unloading their gear, one of the people from the other campsite pointed out into the night sky and asked, "What's that bright star over there?" Well, Jim, Jack, Chuck, and Charlie all looked up.
Directly across the lake, we saw what at first appeared to be an intensely bright star, 3 to 5 times brighter than the next brightest visible star.
This was interesting and definitely out of the ordinary, so Jim took out his binoculars to get a better look.
It was just floating above the treetops. It didn't seem to be moving in any direction. And I looked at it through the binoculars for maybe 15 to 30 seconds, and it suddenly just winked out from the outside edges inward. It just went whoosh like that, and it was gone.
The men pondered. Maybe it was a weather balloon, or perhaps a helicopter that had turned off a light. They watched for a moment to see if maybe it would reappear, but it didn't.
The light extinguished itself from the outside edges, inward to the center. I don't really think much about it, except that I had never observed a light implode like that before.
The incident was quickly forgotten as the men continued to set up camp and make plans for the next day. However, they all said that looking back, that moment seemed to be an ominous preview for the terrifying experience that they would have just 2 days later. Wednesday was uneventful. Well, I guess that's a bit much. This was, after all, the wilderness adventure of a lifetime, and the outdoors and the fresh air were just amazing. Amy read 2 books, gathered notes from several different websites, and watched countless interviews with these men. And before things turned into the extraterrestrial nightmare that it became, they experienced stunning scenery and had breathtaking moments that in themselves would have created memories that would have lasted forever. And as you can imagine, it wasn't always easy. Sure, there were times when the paddling would go so smoothly that they couldn't help but just enjoy being right out there in the middle of the water. But there were also times when the men felt like they weren't making any progress at all, and the paddling was worse than any workout that they could do in any gym. But all 4 men agreed that just being there, away from the hustle and the bustle of everyday life, and experiencing this connection with nature, that in itself was absolutely exhilarating. Thursday, August 25th, they paddled to Eagle Lake and they stopped at the Smith Brook campsite. It's very remote. When they arrived, there was no one there. Well, they ate the last of their food and then they decided that they would try night fishing. Now, in this area of the world, there are no reference lights of any type. The men reasoned that if they were going to paddle out into the darkness, they'd need a way to find their way back. So they built a huge campfire.
That far north, at night, it's pitch black. And we had a nice, good-sized fire going. Not too large that it would get out of control and burn the forest, but it was borderline. It's a fairly good fire that would have lasted 4 hours, bare minimum. And then we struck out onto the lake just as it was getting dark.
The fire was so large that I was worried that it would start a forest fire.
All 4 men climbed into one canoe and paddled out into the water. Charlie paddled from the front as bowman. Chuck took up the helmsman position at the back, and the twins sat in the middle. They were about halfway across the cove, about a quarter of a mile from shore, when Chuck saw something over his right shoulder.
There was this large round globe of light that looked exactly like what we had seen 2 nights previously. Since I was in the rear seat and the object was over my right shoulder, there was a moment when I just sat there with the paddle in my lap, knowing that I was the only one who saw it. Without taking my eyes off it, I drew attention to the object by exclaiming, "That's a hell of a case of swamp gas."
Jim and I both turned around and saw what Chuck was commenting about. At a distance of maybe 200 to 250 yards away, rising out of the woods was a very large, bright, pulsing spherical light. It was not making any noise at all.
Fascinated and completely perplexed, the men turned the canoe so they could all get a better look.
When the light got just above the treetops, it stopped rising and just hovered. It obviously wasn't the moon or a star or anything like that.
They said that the object was at least 80 feet in diameter and spherical. For a bit, they were all just transfixed and intensely curious. It most certainly wasn't the swamp gas that Chuck had just joked about. But what was it?
You could see a fluid pulsating over the face of the object as it changed color from red to green to yellow, white.
The color changes had a fluid quality to them, as if the object were like one big ball of plasma. One of the men described it as being like a thick sauce that was just beginning to roll to a boil.
It lit the treetops up like daylight and was absolutely silent.
The men discussed it, and at first, because it was so far away, they did so somewhat intellectually. What is it? Maybe it's a weather balloon. Maybe it's some type of new stealth technology that the government is toying with way out here in the wilderness. But then Jim came up with an idea. Why not try to signal the thing with the flashlight? Which, of course, was a mistake. All 4 men were in the canoe, watching this huge bright light rise up as if it were coming out of the forest. It just lingered there a little bit above the treetops, and then they did something foolish.
After looking at it for several moments, we decided to signal this thing. And that's when Charlie picked up a flashlight and squeezed off a message.
It moved along the shoreline about 15-20 feet above the trees. I was holding a large flashlight, which I then flashed at the sphere. 3 short, 3 long, and 3 short flashes.
As soon as Charlie lowered the flashlight, the sphere began slowly approaching the canoe. Chuck and Charlie had very different reactions.
I couldn't believe that we were really going to find out what it was.
Well, when the light started coming towards us, my curiosity was satisfied. And I just dropped the flashlight. My only thought was, get to the shore and never look back.
The men started paddling toward the shore as fast as they could, but being on the water, their progress, of course, was painstakingly slow, and in no time at all, this object was nearly over top of them. And then suddenly, a beam, maybe something like a searchlight, shot out from the object and hit the water directly behind them, and then advanced toward the canoe. As it got closer, however, Jim could tell that it wasn't exactly just a beam.
It was like a tube of light and the walls moved, like dust particles do in a light beam.
this tube of light caught up with the canoe, and then, one at a time, each man was somehow sucked up into the light. The next moment, all four men found themselves in a brilliantly lighted examination area of sorts. They said that it was so bright that it hurt their eyes, and they found themselves powerless to move. To make a long story short, they said that they were all examined one at a time, first in a standing position and then lying on a table. They said that they were in a type of mental dullness, as if they were all doped up. 3 of them would be helplessly confined to a sitting position on a bench, while the 4th one was poked and prodded. Later, the men had fragmented memories of the event.
I was afraid. It was cold like a doctor's office. They put a panel over my chest and scraped my arms, chest, legs, and thighs. I looked over and saw Jim, Chuck, and Jack. They were sitting on a bench just outside the room that I was in. They were just sitting there, just staring with blank faces. I kept thinking, we'll be back in the canoe. We'll be back in the canoe.
It was like they were directing us with their minds, and we didn't have any control.
All of my senses were dulled. It was very difficult to maintain awareness. Beings looked almost like people, but they weren't people. They were skinnier, thinner, almost like they had exoskeletons, but they weren't bony. They looked like bugs. They had bug eyes. There were no pupils, and they didn't blink.
One of the things that I found most interesting was how they described the aliens' hands. These creatures had no thumbs, just 4 fingers, but these fingers weren't anything like human fingers. Somehow they worked independently of each other. After going through this, each man drew illustrations of their experiences. Many of these drawings can be found in the book that's titled The Allagash Abductions by Ray Fowler. Jack Weiner drew this picture that we have here in the studio, depicting his recollection of these aliens' hands.
They had 4 opposable digits and an articulating pad in the palm of their hand. When they would take you by the arm, you would feel these 4 fingers and the powerful grip.
They got right up in my face, and they were silently explaining things with their eyes into my head. They were saying, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. We won't harm you." They said, "Just do what we say. Just do what we say."
This experience went on for a while, but it did finally come to an end. And then the men found themselves back in the canoe, not far from shore. At first, they were groggy and disorientated, but then their thoughts all swam back to the present moment. Strangely, however, when they gained their presence of mind, none of them remembered what had just happened. Well, they all paddled to shore, and then they turned around and they saw the light. It was still floating there in the sky. So one of them took out the flashlight and SOS'd it again. But this time, it didn't respond. And a couple seconds later, it started to drift away, and then it completely blinked out of existence, only to appear again a little higher in the sky. The men watched as it did this a few more times until finally it got so high that they lost track of it in the myriad of stars above. At first, the only clue that the men had that something strange had just happened was the fact that the fire was almost out. It should have blazed for hours, and the men puzzled. They had only been out on the water for 30 minutes or so, right? How come the fire was almost out? Well, they would have loved to have puzzled over this for hours, but they were exhausted. So they organized their camp, and then they went to sleep. The next day, they continued their canoeing adventure, and when the 2 weeks were up, they all returned home. And although later, with a little help, each one would begin to remember this terrifying experience, one of them would eventually change his story completely and claim that the whole thing had just been one big lie. Two years after their trip to the Allagash wilderness, Jim Weiner had a pretty bad fall, and as a result of that fall, he began to have these terrible nightmares. In the nightmares, he would see these horrible creatures, and eventually these nightmares began to feel more like memories than nightmares. Well, before long, Jim was seeing a psychiatrist, and then he was put under hypnosis. And as a result of all of this, the other three men were also put under hypnosis. And as you can imagine, they all started to remember what had happened to them that horrible night. Ray Fowler is a researcher and author who's best known for serving as the director of scientific investigations for MUFON, and he even authored one of their field manuals. Well, he heard about this case, and in 1988, he got directly involved. Using his connections and his research skills, he began to try to make sense of the information that was coming out of these hypnosis sessions. Not long into his investigation, however, the men began having these strange experiences. Chuck Rak lived in a very isolated area where people wouldn't just accidentally find themselves. However, during the last few days of October 1989, just as Ray Fowler was revving up his investigation, Chuck reported encountering several trespassers on his property. The first trespasser claimed that he was just out joyriding, and the second one drove off before Chuck could get to his car. But the third one was pretty interesting. Chuck had ran out to do some errands, and when he returned, he saw a man coming out of his driveway holding what he thought was maybe a metal detector. Chuck confronted the man and asked him why he was on his property. The man said that he was investigating Class 6 roads, whatever that means. At first, with all of these random visitors, Chuck thought maybe he was being targeted for a home invasion robbery. But as the man drove off, Chuck got a look at his plates, and he said later that they reminded him of government plates, and possibly even from another state. While the next day, a black, unmarked helicopter buzzed ominously close over top of his house. So he gave all of this information to Ray Fowler, and Ray Fowler worked to get to the bottom of it. There really was no way to check out the first couple of trespassers or the helicopter, but the third one was a different story. He had said that he was investigating Class 6 roads, and apparently he was using a metal detector. So Fowler called the State Division of Transportation and Maintenance, and he spoke to their legal department. He was told that there was no such thing as a Class 6 road, and that the state would definitely not be checking any roads with a metal detector. Jack Weiner had a couple of strange experiences as well, but he never encountered a person on his property, and he never saw a strange helicopter over his house. Only Rak claimed to have had those types of encounters. And interestingly, it was only Rak who eventually changed his mind and said that the whole thing had just been one big lie. In September of 2016, 40 years after the men had claimed to have had these experiences, a two-part article was published in a newspaper called The County. In the article, Chuck Rak spoke with reporter Jessica Potilla, and he said that the Allagash Abductions was just one big lie.
The reason I supported this story at first was, well, I wanted to make money.
Chuck said that although they did witness an unidentified flying object during their canoeing trip, both on the night of the alleged abductions and also 2 nights earlier on Chamberlain Lake, he had no recollection, nor had he ever remembered being taken on board an alien spacecraft. He said that it wasn't exactly a hoax as much as it was just really good storytelling. He went on to talk about discrepancies in the story. He said that the fire wasn't nearly as big as they had made it out to be, so there couldn't possibly have been the loss of time that they had claimed. He also said that they were all using copious amounts of drugs during the trip. Chuck was the only person to have ever changed his story. Charlie Foltz said that Chuck was lying about lying.
Some of the logs we put on the fire were about the diameter of a leg. I would say at least a good 10 inches in diameter, easily.
Charlie said that there was absolutely no drugs.
We bought an 8-pack of beer when we picked up all of the supplies for the canoe trip. We each had 1 beer at Telos Landing the very first night, and we each had 1 beer at Fort Kent the last day of our canoe trip.
This abduction story became well known early on, and the 4 of them were asked to appear on the Joan Rivers show, where they all took a lie detector test. Interestingly, and maybe a telltale, they all 4 past. But perhaps most interestingly was what happened after the show.
Charlie Foltz and I were visiting Jack and his wife Mary at their house in Vermont. Well, one morning, Mr. Rak arrived at the house and declared he had a plan to make $1 million on the Allagash case. His proposal was that all four of us refute the professional handling of the case by Raymond Fowler, thereby creating controversy, which was, in Mr. Rak's mind, exactly what the media and the public crave and pay for.
Jim, Jack, and Charlie all voiced their disgust with Chuck's ethics. They said that they wanted nothing further to do with him. Over time, however, Chuck seemed to just make more and more trouble for the group and the UFO community in general. Things got so bad that eventually he was all but 86'd from MUFON. Then, in 2023, he came out with his own book titled The Allagash Truth. In it, he of course claimed that the whole thing had been just one big lie, but strangely, he also made a crazy accusation, seemingly in an attempt to discredit Jack, claiming that Jack had, now check this out, ordered a hit on a drunk driver who had almost, but didn't, kill Jack's wife Mary in a car crash. Well, if his book is to be believed, then the claims of the abduction was just one big hoax, and one of the people involved was a murderer. If taken seriously, well, that certainly would discredit the entire story. So, were these guys abducted in the Allagash wilderness in 1976, or was it just a lie? You know, I mentioned that all four men had taken a lie detector test on the Joan Rivers show, but what I didn't tell you was they also took a lie detector test before that, before everything got all hyped up, and the results were interesting. Jim, Jack, and Charles all showed no deception, but for some reason, Chuck's came back inconclusive. As Amy was putting this together, I looked over her shoulder and I glimpsed a couple of the interviews that she was watching. One of them was of Charles Foltz. Now, I am no clinician, but if he was sitting across from me, I don't think that I would have any reason to doubt him. He sounded honest and truthful. You know me. I am skeptical at heart, and I'm not sure that I believe that the men were actually abducted. But after learning the information in this report, I can't believe what Chuck to say either. During their abduction, as we pointed out, the men claim to have noted some differences in the anatomy of the aliens' hands. Well, this intrigued Amy, and she looked into it.
Yeah, I agree.
So, what do you have for us today?
Well, I was thinking about the drawings the men made of the aliens and specifically the hands. Something about the aliens' hands must have really made an impression on these guys. And then it got me thinking about our hands and humans being the apex predators on this planet. And I thought, what makes us the apex predators on this planet? Well, yeah, the first thing I found was that most people think that it is our brains. And they say that, humans have big brains and that makes us the top of the food chain. Well, that's true, but we don't have the biggest brains on the planet, right? Elephants have much larger brains than humans. Sperm whales have much larger brains than humans. So then I got into this idea of body-brain mass ratio. That's a mouthful. And I found that there are a couple of animals that have a very similar body-brain mass ratio to humans, and those are dolphins. Probably nobody's surprised about that. But also this animal called the tree shrew.
The tree shrew.
The tree shrew.
What is a tree shrew? That sounds like a mythological creature. Are you sure it exists?
I'm sure it exists. And you're right, though. It does kind of sound like a mythological creature. Well, it actually looks like a squirrel. It's a very small animal. So then, of course, that made me think, well, what do scientists say? If you ask scientists, well, what makes humans the top? And pretty much the consensus is that it is the human brain in tandem with, guess what? The structure of the hand. that puts us as the apex predator on Earth. And scientists go on to say it's, if you think about it, humans are able to manipulate their environment to make tools, to improve their life, to create and use technology. And so all that goes to our brains working in tandem with our unique hand structure. I found that very interesting. Well, of course, I dug a little bit deeper, and I found this paleontologist. Her name is Madeline Boehm, and she and her colleagues have been studying this relationship for years. I found this really cool article in Discover magazine, and here's what she and her colleagues had to say about this. The more skilled our ancestors were with their hands, the more successful they were, and therefore, the higher the survival rate of their offspring. And so advantageous adaptations in hand structure prevailed as natural selection took its course. The evolution of our brain and our anatomy advanced in lockstep. And I found this fascinating, right? Without the structure of our hands, we wouldn't be the apex predator here on Earth.
Right.
Okay, so then I thought a little bit more about these alien hands and the size of the brain, the size of the head that people always draw when they say, they encountered aliens. And it got me thinking, like, whoa, okay, so if our structure of our hand, right, with our, people say 4 fingers and opposable thumb, and our brains put us at a cream of the crop, literally, what does a hand structure that's like 4 finger thumbs, what advantages would that have over the human design? Charlie, I think, mentioned the grip of the aliens, like when they would grip his arm. And I thought, oh my gosh, that had to feel so strange.
Yeah. Yeah. So I got to ask you, like I always do, what do you think about the story? Do you think that the 4 men, so we have two questions here, right? The story could be 2 ways. Do you think they experienced this? Or do you think that they lied about it and then Chuck came forward with the truth?
Wow. This one is a doozy. As far as the abduction goes, I'm at a 50-50. That's just my personal opinion, though. Absolutely personal opinion.
Yeah. So you're on the fence with this one.
I really am. Not about did they see something? I do believe that they saw something that was very strange, orb-like, spherical, not of this world.
Well, okay. So do you think then when they were out in the canoe and they looked up and they saw this light, do you think it was coming toward them and they were paddling back to shore?
I do. Yeah.
So it just stopped and decided not to do anything with these creatures?
I don't
Canoers?
know. I don't know what happened. It was like the more I read, the more I watched, the less convinced and more convinced I was of everything and nothing. That's the best way to summarize this case for me.
Wow. Well, thank you again.
You're welcome.
The journey to create this YouTube channel has been the biggest challenge of my life. When we first started this, silly me, I thought, well, how difficult could it be? I mean, what do? We're just going to share some true stories about some strange events. I couldn't have been more wrong. I wanted to speak compellingly, but genuinely. I wanted to include all of the pertinent facts without overloading the reports with trivial information. I wanted to tell these stories interestingly by adding in sounds and media, but I didn't want to overwhelm the viewer. And I expected to do all of this, creating a brand new feature-length report each week, and it just being Amy and myself. I know, it's crazy. Consequently, when I look back on our earliest work, I cringe. To me, some of it is just horribly bad. However, the information itself is compelling. And early on, we did a story about aliens who live in Earth's oceans and have a serpent as their symbol. It's a very interesting story. It's the Filiberto Gardenias case. In the video, instead of Amy and I having our sit down at the end, she actually calls in and provides additional information that way. And it's incredibly cringe. We thought by doing it like that, we would be providing this extra information in an entertaining way. So if you can put up with a little cringe and maybe, I don't know, watch it on double speed, you might enjoy it. If you'd like to see it, it's here. So I have a question for everybody that stayed to the end.
Okay.
And I'd like you to leave a comment, seriously. What is your favorite type of report that we do? Right? We do alien, we do ghosts, we do conspiracy.
Cryptid.
Yeah. So what's your favorite?